All right, students, continue with our module on skirts. We're in your textbook in chapter 13. You'll find this exercise on page 267. We're going to be designing a yoked skirt with a gathered waist, and we'll be adding a ruffle detail on the bottom. So again, this is in chapter 13 on page 267, skirts with yokes gathered into the waistband. So we'll be doing the slash and spread method for this. And similar to what we did with the drop waistband, we'll be dropping our waistband to do our yoke detail. The yoke will be cut on the fold. The skirt panel could either be cut on the fold or there could be seams depending on what your consumption is on your yardage. We're going to start here with tracing off. I'm going to trace off into the brown paper because it's easier to cut, and then we'll stick it down onto our point paper. So I'm going to first off trace off my center front skirt. I'll stabilize it with my weights. Trace off my waistband, my dart legs, my side seam, and we'll use the same length as the sloper for now for convenience sake. I'm going to note my hip level as a guideline. Using my graph ruler. One second. Using my graph ruler as a guideline to mark my hip level, and making sure that you are, of course, transferring your darts. So I'm marking my dart apexes with my awl, and noting that my dart legs are here. That's the one that's closest to the side seam. This is the dart that's closest to the center front. Note my center front so we don't get lost. So first thing you want to do to design this is, what is your style line on your yoke detail? So for the purposes of what we're going to be doing today, that we're going to draft we're going to have a shaped yoke where it's shaped a little bit deeper on the center front and a little bit higher at the hip line. So remember, when you are drafting your style lines, you want to make sure that you have, or you can also do it as a sweetheart where we do it as a V. Let's do that. We're going to do it as a V. So we're going to drop it. We're going to drop this 5 inches down at the center front. And then I'm going to take this to 3 inches at the side seam. And then we're going to just blend a beautiful sweetheart using our French curve tool. So we're going to draft our style line. So let's do a sweetheart, which is lower in the front and higher in the back, a little bit of a V-neck shape, Cinderella skirts, classic princess Cinderella skirt. So we're going to draft down 5 inches from the center front. I'm going to mark, and I'm going to draft 3 inches down on my side seam hip. Then I'm going to take my French curve, and I'm going to just draft a nice gradual princess line, very flattering. This is you can make it more curve. Just remember, the more curve you add, the more potential variation you might have in the cutting. So those are some of the things to consider. A straighter line is easier to sew in a mass production environment over thousands and thousands of pieces, and easier to maintain than a curved line. So what we're going to need to do is separate these pieces, and we're going to have to close these darts to create our yoke panel, similar to what we did with the waistband facing. A yoke is basically the waistband facing that you physically see. And then in addition to that, we want to create fullness. Just like we did with our circle, skirt, and flare, we're going to slash and spread into these panels and then gather those into the yoke. So I'm going to draft some style lines now from my dart legs. And these you're not going to see on the final design. But they're guidelines in essence. So I'm lining up this plumb line through the center of that dart apex. And there's one. And then the same thing with dart number 2. I'm aligning it with my L ruler perpendicular to my hem. So that's a couple slashes. Now we can go ahead and make a few more. So I'm going to extend it from this other dart leg. And we're only going to be slashing from here, from our below the yoke area. So these are not going to be seen. You want to be kind of equal distant from one another. You're just creating some panels for yourself, which we'll then use as a guide to open up. Make sure you've noted your front grain. Now we're going to cut this out, and we're going to place it on our point paper and create the design line detail. So once I cut this out, okay, once you've cut out your skirt, now we can separate the yoke from the skirt body. These are going to become 2 separate pattern pieces, and then we'll have a third for the ruffle. So the first piece I'm going to deal with is my yoke panel. We're going to demonstrate how to do that. So the first thing you want to do is on the yoke, which is, remember we said this is like a waistband facing on the outside. You'll be able to see this. I'm going to pivot closed on my darts. Remember, I'm going to back off from that edge. And so this is what it looks like before my darts are closed. And now I want to pivot this yoke so that my dart closes. And then I'm closing the second dart. So now, these original places, you want to keep, these could be control notches for you to help match the skirt body with the waistband. You want to have your gathering in through here. Maybe you want to have your shearing and gathering through, you want to back off from the waistband. Maybe you want all the shearing and gathering. So these become part of the design detail. The center front you would cut on the fold. And we would have a 1/4 inch seam allowance for the waistband, a 1/2 inch for the side seam, a 1/2 inch for the join seam, and then you would still need to do an inside waistband facing. Let's do our skirt next. So we're going to slash from the bottom hem up to the yoke seam, backing off about 1/8 of an inch from that yoke seam. And then what we're going to do is pivot these open, just like we had done with our circle skirt and our flare skirt, to get the amount of fullness that we want to have. So we want a nice full. So I'm going to align the bottom panel up here with the center front and secure it. And then what we're going to do is slowly, now see, watch what happens, then it kind of, if you don't secure it all the way. You're going to pivot these so it becomes slightly rounded. You're basically mimicking the shape of what you've done with your yoke. There will be points there, but this is going to be determine how much fullness you want, and then I'll show you, we'll add some additional flare at the side seam for some added flare. So you're going to want to pivot those out, makes like a fan, then you'll secure it, and then we're going to, like we've always done, we'll be blending this. So if I want to add additional flare from this side seam, I want to extend that flare and blend it back into this hip area. This is why we keep that hip level there as a guide. So I can take my graph ruler here and I can basically extend out from that hip. About 1.25 inches is the maximum that you want to give from the original side seam. And just blend that back so that it matches up with the hip level. And then what you're going to do, like everything else, we'll use our French curve, we'll use these pattern pieces as a guide, and then we'll be blending these back. Blending, truing, these are your friends as a pattern maker. These become the language of pattern making. So I'm going to let's use a clear curve tool for this. So you can see, so I'll be taking my red. So you can see you're going to be blending this waistband back so it's nice and smooth. And remember, this style line here was pointed for the yoke, but when we go to do the body of the waistband, we're going to need to make that perpendicular so that it's a smooth gathering. Now here at my bottom hem, I can use my French curve. To get a nice curve line. You might be trimming off some of these points in the blend. And remember, once we hit our center front, we want that to be perpendicular. Our yoke, this would be a separate pattern piece. So when you are blending, you also need to make sure you come back and make the yoke well blended. Remember, this is a sweetheart, so it's a princess, comes through a point. So you want this is your design line. And then back into that hip area and make sure your waistband is also nice and smooth. So you'll do blend that as well. Center front, make sure you transfer your grain line. If this is the center front, it's on the fold. Or if you have a seam, you'll need to make sure you account for the seam allowance. You'd have a 1/2 inch seam allowance to join the yoke and the skirt, a 1/2 inch seam allowance on your side seam. Make sure, now on this particular style, we're not done yet. We have one last thing, and that is we want to add a gentle spiral ruffle. And so in this case, when I mean a gentle spiral ruffle, this is literally like the games you used to play as a kid. We're literally going to trace in a spiral, a ruffle, And then depending on how wide you want that ruffle, the length of it. So in this particular case, our ruffle is 2.5 inches long. So I'd make sure that the length itself here is 2 inches long. You're going to have to join these pieces to multiple seams in order to create a ruffle. Or here's a bigger spiral. Depends on how much excess fabric you have. So if you go into a sewing store, you'll often find this already pre-made. What they've done at the factory, they send out to have it made. But in this case, you can draft it yourself. This one is a 3-inch ruffle. So we would draft our spiral. Literally, if you take a compass, you could graph out 3 inches all the way around. And you would join this seam to seam so you'd have multiple pieces. And then you'd be inserting those into your bottom hem. And that is how we do demo 905, the yoke skirt with fullness and gathering and a ruffle seam.